The fourth aspect we wanted to talk about is the relationship to and with the concept of land. Now you need to understand that when Abram was called to become the father of this new nation, when he was given the covenant in Genesis, he was living in a building, in a city, in a very civilized society. In fact, it's the society that had its own laws, had its own writing. It had all these things that in fact would have made it into what we would be called today a civilized space. But in fact, what he was being called to was to become a nomad. Now, we need to realize that people in the buildings would have looked down on the nomads because the nomads had no land. They had no fixed space. They had no place to call their own. And yet it was that space that Abram is called into. And it's that space, though, that he was called into, but given a promise. And the promise he was given that he would be given a land which would be the land for the Israelites for eternity. A land given to them by God, essentially a holy land or a promised land. And so this concept of land becomes a central concept for the Israelites, and of course even in today, the Zionists, or those who had gone to go and re-establish the nation of Israel, becomes such an important part and such a major force driving the people of Israel. So what we have is that they move around. Abram gets into Canaan, and there takes over some of the empty land. We need to realize that the earth's population at the time of Abraham was very small. And so what we ended up with was these small tribal families, nomads, drifting around some of those areas. In fact, even today, if you go into some of the areas in the Middle East, you can still see some of the Bedouin who still do the same thing that they've been doing for thousands of years, of traveling around from place to place, from pasture to pasture, from waterhole to waterhole. And that's really what would have happened with Abraham, is that he would have set up space, but he wouldn't have had a walled city. He wouldn't have had buildings. They would have lived in tents. They were the people of tents. It's only later on that we see that from the time of Jacob and Esau that we begin to see the development of towns. But even those are just still collections of that one family. Where everything begins to change is, of course, after the Exodus. The Israelites have been in Egypt, in slavery, for a few hundred years. They've now grown to nation status. They've grown to have enough people to actually be a national people, to actually have a national sense of identity and culture and ethnicity. And it's as they travel into the promised land with Joshua that in fact things begin to change. Because no longer now are they nomads just moving from pasture to pasture, but now they are allocated land in the subdivision of Canaan as the tribes go into that land. Now, exactly how that happened, the scholars will disagree. Some of the scholars will say that the book of Joshua is right on. That's exactly what happened, is that the people all came in as one big flood and wiped out all the local inhabitants of Canaan and took over their land. There are other scholars that believe that in fact that happened over a long period of time, that in fact the Israelite tribes began to kind of infiltrate into Canaan and didn't really kill off all the population, but rather began to slowly supplant them. And then there's others who say that in fact it was a combination of these things. Now, to some degree, I think it was a combination of them. And the reason why is that I don't think that Joshua did go in and kill everybody off, because of course a few hundred years later, when David wants to establish his capital in Jerusalem, he has to take it away from another tribe. And the tribe, of course, is the Jebusites, who at that stage were still living behind a walled city. Now one has to ask that if Joshua had gone in and destroyed all the tribes that were in the Holy Land, how is it that the Jebusites were still there 300 years later in a walled city? Well, the only answer to that is that in fact Joshua is there for a different reason. It's not there to talk about what exactly happened, but rather there to talk about the sense of ownership. Again, the concept of ownership and possession of land. Now again, the problem I suppose as well for Pacific Islanders is that for Pacific Islanders, their relationship with land is different, and particularly their relationship with the concept of the sea. And we'll talk a little bit about that later in a following module. But for the Jews, the sea was a place of where evil came from rather than good. which of course is the opposite of what the Pacific Islanders would actually look at the sea. In fact, for the Jews, all good came from the land, as we can see in Genesis chapter 2. So in Genesis chapter 2, we have the second creation story. And of course, that creation story is a very physical, very earthy story. It's a very land-based story. And so what we realize is that man is made not from some image of God, but man is made out of the dust of the earth. Now, that word dust that's used often, particularly within the King James Version, is really not a useful one. The word that should be used instead, or at least the Hebrew word that's used there, is the fertile part of the soil. And I love that, because it's not just dust that's just flying around outside, but rather it's the part that we grow things in, that we grow things out of. And in a sense, what God does is He takes the fertile soil and He grows mankind out of it. Now, I think that's a wonderful illustration of what God does, that He is able to make us out of that which is fertile, to bring forth and to bear forth fruit and to offer fruit to the world as we do it from that point of view. And so it's that concept that's within the Jewish or the Israelite understanding of land. It is a place of fertility. It's a place of growth and of development and of movement. It's a place where people can come from and connect with. It's a place which God can bless and can be fruitful and multiply, but most of all, which can look after the land that it has been given. So this concept of land is central to the whole Tanakh. And that's why you can understand the absolute terror that the exile would have been, because they had lost the land that they had been given. That land which they had been given had been lost, and they were taken to a land which was not their own. If you want to get a glimpse of the sense of the pain and the terror that the exile created, all one has to do is to look at Psalm 137. And in Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, you can see the anger, the pain that they have, particularly in the last verse. It's the verse that Boney M doesn't sing, where in fact he talks about where the psalmist writes about the fact that they wish they could take the babies of the Babylonians and smash their heads against rocks. It's not quite the thing that you sing in Sunday school, is it? But essentially it gives you a sense of just how important the land was in understanding who they were and their sense of self-identity. So whenever you read Tanakh, always be aware of the fact of that. It's Jesus who reinterprets the concept of land by saying that no longer will the land just be the promised land of Israel, but now the land of God will become the whole world.